Hello and welcome to this edition of Labrador Lodge Project. We've relocated from the kitchen to the dining room today. We've got thunder and lightning outside, it's been pouring rain, but thankfully we have a lot of work to do inside. As I mentioned in the last episode, today we will be patching the walls. We're going to cover four main types of problems: small cracks, large cracks, holes, and areas that need to be resurfaced. So we'll go ahead, get out of the nice clothes, and get ready to do some work. Boom, we're ready to go. Now our tools for today are a bucket full of repair compound and a few different sizes of putty knives. We'll use these to go around and take care of the different problems. We're going to go ahead and relocate now over to the downstairs hallway where you can get a close-up on how to repair some of these different cracks. Okay, our first one is this crack here. As you can see, it's a very narrow, small crack that goes along. It's not particularly long. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to take a small paste knife. We're going to get some paste on there, and we're going to go ahead and just dab it in a couple places along the crack. Alright, I'm going to get most of the excess off. And now what we want to do is we want to make sure that we get this pushed into the crack. You don't want to have it go just over and around the crack. You want to push it into the crack. So we'll push it in one direction, and then we'll push it in another direction to get it down into the crack. Then we'll go ahead and push it down into the crack, along the crack, down, and then we'll go ahead and push it into the crack, along the crack, up. We'll scrape off some of the excess, and now we'll switch to a slightly larger knife. And with this larger knife, we're going to go ahead and not pushing down too hard. I'm just going to skim over to get off any large bumps. And you can look along real carefully with your eyes and make sure that you can see that the crack is filled in between. Okay, now what we have here is a very large gouge out of the wall, but what we really had to start was a crack that was somewhat wide. And what you need to remember about cracks in your wall when you have them is that the inside edge is not even. It doesn't cleave perfectly straight across. Sometimes it bends backwards into the back of your plaster work. When you do that, if it's wide enough crack, even if you put in some joint compound, it may still be loose around the back and you may still have problems. So what I've done here is I've dug out in sort of a V shape this crack. I made the crack larger in order to be able to repair it. Now I didn't go all the way through, all the way back to the lath. Don't really need to do that. Just need to be able to create an even surface down that you know you're not going to have a gap going back behind the plaster. Now this hole is fairly large, so this is not a one-step process. What you do is you take your little knife, get some compound on there, and go ahead and push it in on the one side. You can sort of just push it in and then scrape a little bit. And the same over here. All right. Now what you see is there's still a dent here. What I've done is I've pushed it into the areas of the existing plaster work, so that way it seals up to that and creates a nice edge. You're going to want this to dry and set up, and then you're going to come back, and let's pretend for a moment it's dry so I can go ahead and show you this. If it were dry, you'd come back and you'd put in some more compound, and you would do the same thing, except for that time you do it, chances are you would have maybe only a little bit of a divot, sort of like this, left behind. Once again, you would let that dry. And when that's finally dry, then is when you would put on what's left of your material, same as before with the small crack, and go back and forth and back and forth, and then take your larger knife and smooth it out. Now, as you can see, we can't smooth this out. There's all these bubbles and gaps. The reason for that is that it's not dry. So if you try to fill a crack like this one, and you're putting in compound, and when you try to smooth it out, you're getting all these drag marks and dents, and it's not working. Well, what you need to do is you need to go in there, go like this, and pull out the extra compound. The fact of the matter is, if it starts to look bad and it's not working, the simple answer is you put in too much and you're trying to do too much at one time. You can't just go ahead and throw in large gobs of compound inside of your cracks. You need to build it up and let it dry out a little bit over time. Now I'm going to go ahead and fix my repair. So it's going to go back now to the way it was when I first showed you. You see that you still have a V shape, but now you've got your initial layer of compound, and that's going to go ahead and set up. I'm going to come back later on and build it up like I just showed you. But remember, if you see those kinds of bubbles or dragging, that means that you have it too thick and it's not right. You need to take some out and build it up in pieces. Okay, now we're back in the dining room, and what you're looking at here is an area under the window where I took out all of the plasterwork when I was scraping. Now the reason why I did this is because when I pressed on it, it was a little wiggly. Now that's not that uncommon in an old house under a window. People open windows and rain gets in and it makes a little bit of moisture, or there's condensation that comes in, or you might have an active leak. Now you want to check and make sure that nothing's damp, you don't have an active leak, or else you'd be wasting your time fixing this. But this was bone dry, and it's more than likely either condensation was collecting by the window and pooling under here and making it a little loose, or maybe the window was left open at some point in the past. It didn't break off, it just was a little bit loose, and I broke off anything that was easily coming off. And over here you see this hard edge. This is the finished plaster, and this is the brown coat underneath. Here the finished plaster did not come off, and it did not wiggle. That's where I stopped. I went, well, probably a little bit over here it stopped wiggling, and I broke a little bit more off just to be sure. So that's the edge we're going to work against as we go ahead and bring this across and flatten this back out. Now, you can build it up as thick as this if you want to do that and do it in a couple layers, or you sort of smooth it out and work it across the best that you can. Now we do have some areas down below where the plaster was well adhered, and I didn't break it out because I didn't want to go back behind this molding and cause any sort of problems. So we're going to end up building it out a little bit in multiple layers. This is not that different than what we already talked about with fixing in the large crack. What we're going to go ahead and do is we'll take some compound onto our digging knife, I'll call it that. It's our little knife. That's the one I like to use to get the compound on. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to go over here and start against our plaster edge, basically building ourselves a little ramp that connects to our plaster edge. This is what we need to do to be able to get the start on what we're doing. See, if you go this direction, the crack comes back out. So what we're going to do is make sure we go this direction and get ourselves connected and push it into that plaster edge. Then we can take our medium-sized knife that we used before and just go right down along the plaster edge so that we're not making the original wall any thicker. That gets our edge over there. Now, we're going to have to come back and do more of it. We're going to have to do some sanding to make things even. So what we want to do right now, rather than worry about trying to connect everything together and make it look real pretty, we just want to get some of this repair compound over top of the brown coat everywhere. Okay, so I'm pushing it in. Now you hear me sort of scraping with this little one. What I'm doing is making sure the compound is getting in to the pores of the brown coat. I don't want it to ride over top. I want to get it into the pores here. I'm going to come back with a larger knife in a minute and flatten this out some so that it's not such a big mess and we don't have to sand quite as much. But what I want to do first is I want to make sure that we get plenty of adhesion to the existing plaster base coat. I want this compound to be in all the pores. That's how it's going to hold on. If you don't get it pushed in, this is going to float on top of what you currently have, and you'll be right back where you were with a top layer that's not adhered to the bottom layer. You need to get that adhesion between the layers, and you see it's very porous, the undercoat. There's a lot of pores in it, a lot of things you have to fill in. See, if I scrape really, really tight, you can just see this little stipply look. I'm not going quite that hard with it. I just want to make sure I'm getting it in to those spots. When you do that, then, as I said, you have made sure that what you're going to have is a surface that you can work on in increasing layers to build it up and not have it just floating and falling off of all your work going to waste. So that's got an initial bit there. I'm going to go ahead and just take a little bit more and very lightly just sort of dab it on in a couple places, just like this. I'm not worrying about smoothing it because this is my small knife. I'm just dabbing it on like a cake frosting here, pretty much. Then I'm going to take a larger one of these knives, and this one you haven't seen me pull out yet. This is a much wider one. When we were doing our crack hole repairs, we were using this one here. Now we're going with a much wider one. And what we're going to do with this wide one is we're going to, don't mess with this edge over here that we did that goes against your new plaster. Stay away from that. Just lightly pull it across. Take off the excess against the edge of your bucket and then lightly go across again. Now the other option, if you don't want to do this, or if you have large areas where this came off and you just think it's going to be too much work, you could just break it out, cut it out down to the lath, and then put in one sheet of drywall and then smooth your compound across to try to mirror the two materials. That's the one issue you're going to find if you go ahead and replace sections with drywall next to your existing plaster work. What you're going to find is that you've got a machine finish when you're using drywall as opposed to a hand finish. And even though you get a nice flat wall with plaster, it's got sort of like an artisan difference to it. Even though it's flat, you can see that it's not 100% perfect. You don't notice that when everything is plaster. You notice it when you put in a section of drywall, and that section of drywall stands out like a sore thumb. So if you do decide to do a repair where you break out the plaster and just put in a patch, like you were filling a large hole, because you don't want to do a whole lot of this building up, that's fine. But then skim material across, all the way across on top of that drywall. So that way you can have a finish that somewhat mimics what you have. Otherwise, it really is going to stand out. Even after you paint it, it's going to glare out as being different from the rest of your wall. But I would recommend, if the plaster is still intact, keep the plaster. One thing about these old houses with plaster and lath is nothing stops the sound like a plaster lath wall. And you can crank up music, make as much noise as you want between plaster lath walls, and the only place where the noise gets through is through a doorway. Whereas when you put in just drywall, you know as well as I do that drywall walls, they're more echoey and the sound goes through them. Unless you insulate the interior wall, you end up having you can just hear between one room and another. It's like having paper thin walls. Only a wall that has some masonry to it is going to be able to stop the sound, and that's what you have when you have plaster lath. You've got a layer of masonry. It's almost like having a block wall between you and the next room, because you have a layer on this side and a layer on the other side. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about was holes. So that was what I was talking about with holes, is building it up like we did with the large crack, or cutting out a piece and inserting in some drywall. You could, if you had a hole and you wanted to do the brown coat in, because you went down to the lath and you want to build it up and you want to use this brown coat plaster, I'm not going to talk about that because that's not something I do. It's not something that I really have any skill with, and it's something that would take a little bit of skill. So I'm not even going to try to tell you about that. If that's something that needs to be done, you might want to get a real plaster. Well, that about does it for this episode. Now you know a little bit about being able to repair small cracks, large cracks, holes, and areas where you need to resurface. Now, you can go ahead and try this on your own. I have a whole lot of walls that I need to do this too. And so it's going to be a little while before I finish that. I have multiple layers to build up. So you're not going to see another episode of this probably for a little over a week. While I go ahead and finish those things and then do the next step, which I'm not going to show you, but I did tell you about. And that's when you go back and wash down all of the walls and everything else and make a nice clean surface to paint on. So the next time you see me, it will be because we're putting paint on these walls. Have a good time.